Good evening. How are you? I hope you enjoyed this nice sunny day. I'm Allison McFarlane. I'm a professor here and director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. Before we begin this evening, I want to acknowledge first that all of us are gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples. And I also want to take a moment this evening to acknowledge that this evening, like numerous others that we've had in these great halls, is only possible because of the extraordinary vision and the heart and the great generosity of Phil Lind, who sadly passed away last year. Phil, you have our heartfelt gratitude for sharing your intellectual curiosity and making these events possible. And on behalf of everyone gathered here and the UBC community, we thank you. So it's my great pleasure then to kick off the third talk in this year's series on popular culture and political life in the United States. In these conversations, we explore how artistic expression and popular culture contributes to our understanding of political life in the US. We began the discussion with Gia Tolentino and followed up with Suleika Jawad and John Baptiste. And although our guests speak to American political landscapes, there's much, of course, that we can learn here in Canada from their experiences. Before I introduce our moderator and speaker tonight, let me do a bit of housekeeping. We're going to be taking audience questions in the latter part of the event through Slido. You simply visit slido.com on your phone or computer and enter the code #LindSlido to input your question. And you should feel free to submit your questions or to upvote a question that you see listed and that you'd like to hear be asked by our moderator. And lastly, just a reminder to silence your cell phones before we begin. And so with that, I'm really excited to introduce our moderator and our speaker for tonight's event. So our moderator is one of our own, Dr. Christopher Patterson, who's an award-winning author and associate professor in the Social Justice Institute here at UBC. His publishing record ranges from the critically acclaimed Transitive Cultures, Anglophone Literature of the Trans-Pacific to his first novel, Stamped, an anti-travel novel, which was adapted into a video game. His forthcoming book, Domesticating Brown, Movements of Racial Imagination, will be published next year. And now, I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Dr. Viet Thanh Nguyen. Known for bold, elegant, and fiercely honest writing, Dr. Nguyen won the Pulitzer Prize and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for his debut novel, The Sympathizer, which has been adapted into an HBO miniseries that will premiere next month. He's also written a collection of short stories in The Refugees, brought together fellow refugee writers with The Displaced, and was a finalist for the National Book Award with Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War. He was named a MacArthur Fellow, the Genius Grant, in 2017, is a culture critic at large for the Los Angeles Times, and is the Errol Arnold Chair of English and a professor at the University of Southern California. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nguyen.
Hello. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for that introduction, Allison, and good evening, Vancouver and the University of British Columbia. It's such a pleasure to be here, I think for the first time for me, but also it's such a pleasure to return to Canada, especially as Canada is home to some of my collaborators in this HBO TV series of The Sympathizer. What that means is, if you haven't read The Sympathizer, you never have to read The Sympathizer. Just watch it on TV. But it was really important for me to collaborate with people who are not Americans in the making of this TV series. So the producer who optioned the series, Neve Fitchman, is from Toronto. Our co-showrunner and head writer, Don McKellar, is a Canadian filmmaker. Sandra Oh, of course, is in it. She's Canadian. And we have a couple of actors, Fred Nguyen Can and Duy Nguyen, who are Vietnamese Canadians as well. And the reason why, the reason why I thought it was important, give it up for your own people. You're too modest. I mean, the reason why I felt that it was important not to work with Americans in the making of this TV series is that Americans would totally screw me on this because Americans are so preoccupied with their version of the war in Vietnam from an American-centric point of view that I think it's really hard for Americans to see outside of that framework. And I, for one, I think can speak with authority on this issue because I was born in Vietnam, but I was made in America. So I came to the United States as a refugee in 1975, my family having fled from Vietnam because we had been on the losing side. And obviously being a refugee was a difficult experience, but I am kind of grateful for it because it left me with the requisite emotional damage necessary to become a writer. A lot of that damage was afflicted by American popular culture, especially the movies, with Hollywood being America's unofficial ministry of propaganda. Hollywood made a lot of movies about the war in Vietnam, and that was actually my first exposure to the history of the war was through movies like Apocalypse Now. And I saw Apocalypse Now when I was much too young for it. I was probably 12 years old, and my parents, these hardworking refugees who never got time to spend with me, had bought a VCR. There was this cutting-edge culture in the early 1980s. So I watched Apocalypse Now on that VCR. And as a young boy, I identified as an American. And I was a war fanatic. I loved watching American war movies. I identified with the American soldiers. And in watching Apocalypse Now, set in Vietnam, I identified with the American soldiers. Up until the moment they massacred Vietnamese civilians. And at that point, I was split in two. Was I the American doing the killing, or was I the Vietnamese being killed? And I was shaken very deeply by that experience, but at 12 years of age, I don't think I realized how deeply I was shaken by that experience. I suppressed it, I forgot about it, didn't think about it again until I went to college at the University of Communists at Berkeley. And there, in a film class, I was asked to recount a cinematic episode that made a deep impact on me, and the first thing I thought about was that massacre in Apocalypse Now. And as I talked about that massacre, as I recounted it to the class, I found myself shaking with rage and anger. And it was that moment, I think, that I realized that stories not only have the power to save us, which I do believe, because stories saved me as this young refugee boy trying to find refuge in the stories of literature and the movies. Stories not only had the power to save us, but if they had that power, they had the power to destroy us as well. And that's what I felt in watching Apocalypse Now. And not just Apocalypse Now. I have seen almost every movie that Hollywood has made about the war in Vietnam. And that is an experience I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese. But watching those movies from the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s to the 2000s, let me know that all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. The power of that second campaign in memory that was carried out on celluloid from the American perspective, that was so powerful that I internalized that American perspective. I internalized the ideology that was found in those movies. How did I know that? Well, a couple years after I watched Apocalypse Now, I went to high school. I went to a primarily white high school, except there were a handful of us who were not white. We were of Asian descent. We knew we were different. We just didn't know how to put it into words. So every day we would gather in a corner of the campus, and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. It's the only language we had for ourselves was this racist language. And the irony that was lost on us was that Asians have never invaded the United States. If anything, it's the United States that has invaded Asia. It's a point I make in both The Sympathizer and the last book I wrote, A Man of Two Faces, which is that many refugees are grateful for having been rescued by the United States, but maybe we wouldn't have needed to be rescued by the United States if we hadn't been invaded by the United States in the first place. This idea of the Asian invasion threatening the United States is, of course, both an old one and a new one. If you remember from 2020, not too long ago, in the era of COVID, Donald Trump described that as the China virus and the Kung flu. And in response, liberals were angry. They're like, no, we cannot use this racist language to describe Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, a sentiment I heartily agree with. Except I had to remember that in 2019, HBO made a really good TV series called Watchmen. I don't know how many of you have seen that TV series. If you're a liberal, it's great, because the villains in it are the Ku Klux Klan, and our hero is a black woman police officer. But one of the subplots in Watchmen involved a Vietnamese character, because in this alternate universe, America had won the war in Vietnam, and Vietnam had become the 51st state of the United States. And this Vietnamese character's name was Lady Jill, named after one of the most iconic legends in Vietnamese history. Lady Jill in the HBO series Watchmen is a trillionaire and a genius, and she has used her intelligence and her wealth to try to make the world a better place. Only that's not how it's interpreted by the other characters in the TV series. So in the end, Lady Jill has to die. And she dies in the most American way possible, via aerial bombardment. So the last thing you see of Lady Jill, played by Hong Chow, the last thing you see of Lady Jill is her death under a rain of frozen squid dropped from outer space. Don't tell me how to interpret this for you, and I'm not even going to have time to recount this complicated plot episode, but that is the way that she dies. And that was perfectly acceptable entertainment in an anti-racist series from 2019. And then we have to remember that in 2021, a gunman in Atlanta shot and killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. And the Asian American reaction to that immediately was, this is a racist and sexist act, born out of Orientalist fantasies carried by this white male gunman. And so I do see a distinct connection between the ideology of popular culture and the manifestation of that ideology in violence, even in series created by the liberals of Hollywood. But when we think of anti-Asian violence and we think of incidents like the murder of 6 Asian women or many other kinds of violent incidents throughout American and Canadian history, from physical actions to legislation, I think one of the things that I have to remind myself and to remind you is that the greatest acts of anti-Asian violence have been America's wars in Asia, which have killed millions of people. This is not something, the way that I've phrased it, it's not something that is spoken often about by Asian American writers or by Asian Americans in general. And that's because I think that Asian Americans have lived under conditions of what I call narrative scarcity. Narrative scarcity is when almost none of the stories are about you. And when a story about you comes along, you get very excited. So when Crazy Rich Asians came out, all the Asians freaked out. We're like, oh my God, at last, a movie about us. Too bad it's not a very good movie. And I'm being very unfair to Crazy Rich Asians. I admit it. I've read the book by Kevin Kwan, but I haven't seen the movie. And it's unfair of me to say this about Crazy Rich Asians because all that Crazy Rich Asians wants to be is a romantic comedy. Nobody involved in that thought that they would have to carry the burden of Asian representation. But under conditions of narrative scarcity, that's exactly what happens. Now, the opposite of narrative scarcity is narrative plenitude. That's when almost all of the stories are about you. And this is how you know you are a part of a majority. However you choose to define that majority, almost all of the stories are about you. And so when a story about you comes along that you don't like because you don't see yourself in that story, you can simply say, it's just a story. Because there are literally 1,000 other stories that you can turn to. But if you live under narrative scarcity, you don't have that luxury of calling a story just a story. And so, faced with these conditions of narrative scarcity, the temptation for so-called minority writers or artists is to turn to the logic of representation and inclusion. We want to be represented. We want to have our voices heard. We want to tell our stories. We want to be included. And in order to do that, a couple of things have to happen. Number one, you should not say things like, the greatest acts of anti-Asian violence have been America's wars in Asia. Americans don't want to hear that. And what you should also paradoxically understand is that under this logic of representation, inclusion, narrative scarcity, if you are a so-called minority, you're given one story to tell. As the poet Bao Fi has said, you're given one trauma to talk about. And if you deviate and you talk about traumas that are not your own, you are rapidly silenced or effectively not published. Your stories are not heard. And so when I was becoming a writer, I knew very well that the logic of representation and inclusion and narrative scarcity demanded of someone like me that I talk about Vietnamese refugees and the Vietnam War. That was my one trauma, my one story. And if you've read The Sympathizer, you will hopefully understand that it is a Vietnam War novel, but it is more than that as well. It is also, in my mind, a critique of American imperialism. And the difference is that Americans want to understand the Vietnam War as a singular episode in their history, a regrettable episode in their history. That's not how I see it. I think of the Vietnam War as one moment in a long history of American imperialism that goes back to the very origins of the country, a country that has been founded on a contradiction that is still with us today. And that contradiction is between the founding of the country as a country of freedom and democracy on the one hand, and a country that is made possible through enslavement, genocide, colonization, and war. Now, that very basic contradiction creates a problem for someone like me, because my acts of writing are made possible by that promise of freedom and democracy. And on the other hand, my privileges as a writer and as a citizen, as a refugee who has come to the United States and been rescued, all of those privileges are made possible by living on colonized land. So that reality of living as a refugee and as a writer in a settler colonial country has made me reflect upon the history of the United States and how we tell stories about it and how I tell stories about it. From my perspective, the United States was founded on settler colonialism. It expanded westward across Mexico to the western frontier of Canada, and then it kept on moving. Moved into the Pacific, to the Philippines, to Guam, to other Pacific islands, because the ultimate ambition of the United States and its expansion was to reach China and the markets there. And so the United States went to China, and it went to Japan, and then it went into Korea, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. A trajectory from East to Southeast Asia punctuated by these wars that killed millions of Asians. In my mind, the war in Vietnam was both foreshadowed by all the wars that came before it and would in turn foreshadow the wars that came after it in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which have been called the Middle East, which were also a part of Asia as well. And the culmination of that in our time is the war in Palestine, the war on Gaza conducted by Israel, for whom the United States is the chief supporter and the chief supplier of weaponry. My thinking in this vein has been influenced by Edward Said and his book Orientalism, a book that Asian Americans like myself have pillaged, because we have taken Edward Said's arguments about Orientalism and applied them to East and Southeast Asia, to the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, and this idea that we have been these fantastic others in the American imagination, the objects of fantasy and desire and violence and hatred. But Said wasn't talking about East and Southeast Asia when he was talking about Orientals. He was talking about what we call the Middle East. He was talking about French and British imperialisms and the construction of Muslims and Arabs as Oriental others. So in my mind, there is a whole continuity between the creation of Oriental others in the American imagination and the creation of Oriental others in the French and the British imaginations. Now, as you can imagine, me making these kinds of arguments is not always popular in the United States. And when I set out to write the Sympathizer, I set out to offend everybody. Judging from my hate mail, I succeeded. There are Americans out there who think I'm anti-American. And then there are Vietnamese Americans who think I'm a communist. How do I know this? My own students tell me that. They say, my parents think you're a communist. And then not too long ago, a young Vietnamese American woman came up to me at an event, and she said, you are the second most hated person in my parents' household. The most hated person? Joe Biden. Ironically, the Vietnamese government thinks I am anti-communist, which is why we were not allowed to shoot the TV series of The Sympathizer in Vietnam. We had to shoot it in Thailand, which is why we're not allowed to air the series in Vietnam, and which is why The Sympathizer to this day is not published in Vietnamese in Vietnam. So after finishing The Sympathizer, I had to ask myself, who else is there left to offend? The answer, obviously, was the French. So I wrote a sequel to The Sympathizer called The Committed. It's a gangster drama that continues the adventures of The Sympathizer. And the reason why it takes place in France, in Paris, is because the Sympathizer himself is partly Vietnamese and partly French. So he has to go to France to investigate this other side of his heritage, and he has to settle in the refugee quarters of Paris. So I think of this as the anti-Emily in Paris with The Committed. There's a gangster drama, lots of sex and violence, all the good stuff that you also saw in The Sympathizer, and there's also a satire of French colonialism and French pop culture. And you have to remember that the United States came into what the French called Indochina and took over the French colonial project. No one made the United States do that. The United States deliberately decided to come in and to continue what it is that the French could not finish in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, the French, in my opinion, have gotten off pretty easy in regards to the historical memory of what they did in French Indochina. And the irony here is that the United States unofficial Ministry of Propaganda in Hollywood has been so successful in projecting the story of the American war in Vietnam all over the world that much of the world thinks of it as a bad war due to American photos, American journalism, American news reports, and American movies. And the French got away with it. You have to remember, the Vietnamese revolutionaries described the experience of the Vietnamese under French colonization as an experience of slavery. But the French kind of got away with it in historical memory because we're only left with some very romantic black and white photographs of that time period. And the movies that the French have made about their French colonial period, The Lover, Indochine from the early 1990s, casts this romantic glaze over an awful period of history. Right? So you have to turn to someone like Viet Thanh, Cambodia's preeminent filmmaker, to get a contradiction of this French version of events. He wrote a book, a memoir, called The Elimination. And Viet Thanh survived the genocide as an adolescent and then became a filmmaker. And then as an adult, he went to find the only Khmer Rouge cadre at the time who had been convicted of any crimes in terms of the genocide, a man named Duch, who was the commandant of S-21 prison camp in Phnom Penh, which you will likely visit if you go as a tourist to Phnom Penh. But in the S-21 prison camp, Duch oversaw the torture and murder of 17,000 Cambodians. And so Ritipan wanted to interview him to understand what drove him to do what he did. Ritipan's argument in The Elimination is that Cambodia belongs at the center of human history. And he says this not because the Cambodians were the victims of a genocide, but because the Cambodians were the agents of their own genocide. They were both the victims and the victimizers. And he reminds us that the leaders of the Khmer Rouge were scholarship students who went to Paris. And there they learned the best of Western civilization. And they took those ideas of the Enlightenment and they brought them back to Cambodia and perfected them in their own way. So for Ritipan, the argument is that Western civilization reaches a climax in the Cambodian genocide. Ritipan is writing from the perspective of the colonized. And from the perspective of the colonized, Western civilization and genocide cannot be separated. The language of humanism and civilization that the West enacts for itself requires an inhuman other. And that inhuman other under colonization is then subject to all kinds of inhuman behavior by the so-called humanized. Ritipan's argument recalls what the poet and critic Aimé Césaire wrote in 1955 in his book Discourse on Colonialism. As he reflects on the European colonization of Africa, he also reflects on the Holocaust. And he argues that the Holocaust is the culmination of what Europe had already done in Africa. The methods of genocide had already been carried out on Africans, and then Europe turned those methods back onto itself. This is the point that Joseph Conrad also made in Heart of Darkness, which was an inspiration for Apocalypse Now. In Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad says that Western civilization is the veneer that covers up the organized looting of Africa by Europe and the extermination of Africans. Now, Aimé Césaire had nothing positive to say about the United States in Discourse on Colonialism, but he did not say that the Holocaust was not only the outcome of European colonization, but that the Holocaust was also the outcome of American colonization, that Hitler and the Nazis drew explicit inspiration from the genocide conducted by the United States against indigenous peoples and by U.S. racial policies towards enslaved Africans and black people. So that history that I've been drawing on of genocide, enslavement, colonization, they would percolate eventually to reach Europe as well. And so the Holocaust should be understood as a culmination both of centuries of anti-Semitism as well as European and American colonization. But the Hollywood version, or the mainstream Western version of the Holocaust, excises that history of colonization and leaves us only with anti-Semitism. Treating the Holocaust as an exception to Western civilization rather than an expression of Western civilization is what allows the West to continue seeing itself as a source of humanism, which then ironically allows the continued justification of massacres and drone strikes and the like conducted under the name of humanitarian intervention and humanitarian war. That exception to civilization continues, I think, with Israel's war in Gaza and on Palestinians, supported by the West. Israel and the West value Jewish and Israeli lives as being more human than those of Palestinians. And that allows all kinds of inhuman behavior to continue. It's one of the reasons why one of the Israeli government ministers described Palestinians as human animals, which is ironically a term that could have been applied to the Jews under the Holocaust as well. I'm going to wrap up by returning to this idea that stories have the power to save us and to destroy us at the same time. And that's true not just for writers, but for states and statesmen and presidents and political leaders as well. I'll give you an American example. In the aftermath of the war, American war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the temptation for Americans has been to treat those wars as exceptions. They were exceptions because they were failures. The United States lost those wars and had never experienced such losses before. They were also exceptions because they were not carried out in the American tradition. In other words, they were an aberration from the way that the United States would normally conduct itself. And one of the ways that Americans have been able to argue that the wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia have been exceptions is to reduce the scale of the horror that took place. One example, Jimmy Carter, president, Democrat, 1977, said that the destruction was mutual in the war. That is quantifiably false. 58,000 plus Americans died in the war, which is a tragedy. 3 million Vietnamese died in the war. Several hundred thousand Laotians, Cambodians, and Hmong died during the war. In the immediate aftermath of the war, hundreds of thousands more would die, fleeing as refugees, being interned in re-education camps, and in the case of Cambodia, 1.7 million Cambodians dying in the Khmer Rouge genocide that was at least partly enabled by the US mass bombing of Cambodia. So the destruction was not mutual, but the temptation to call it mutual is a justification for colonization and genocide. Colonization and genocide are by intention asymmetrical, but the retrospective narration, the memory of colonization and genocide is cast as symmetrical by the former colonizers because it's in their interest to cast that history as a both and conflict where everyone was equal on both sides, and that is simply not true. So, myself, as a writer, I believe in the power of stories to save and to destroy. And I recognize that literature is engaged also in an asymmetrical conflict. On the one hand, in this battle, we have books and we have words. On the other hand, we have military-industrial complexes and we have ministries of propaganda. In this asymmetrical conflict, I side with the human animals, whoever they are. Thank you.
Great speech, thank you. Happy birthday.
Thank you so much. Yes! Woo!
All right.
This was I just attended Chris's seminar. It's the first time I ever had a seminar where someone gave me a birthday cake. Thank
We
you so
sang
much.
happy birthday, so we're not going to force everyone here to do it. Also, welcome to sunny Vancouver. It's always like this. If you move here, you won't ever regret it. Trust me, nobody does. It's not a thing. But I wanted to begin with where you were ending. And you wrote this amazing piece in The Nation on expansive solidarity, which I don't think was a term, it's a bit hard to hear from the green room, but I don't think was one that you were using very much in this talk. And I think that's specific maybe to Asian American studies, Asian American writers. But I'm curious about how you, as somebody who takes that position and identity as an author, saw yourself, taken on, well, I guess we could say embroiled in a lot of the controversies in October, and why it's important for Asian Americans, Asian Canadians perhaps, to speak out about these issues.
Well, I don't think it's just Asian Americans or Asian Canadians. I think it's just an obligation for all of us. But speaking specifically from this Asian American or Asian Canadian point of view, I became an Asian American at Berkeley through a moment of radicalization, through an exposure to some of the history that I described in this talk. And understanding the place of Asians in North America gave me an identity. On the one hand, we had been miscast as Orientals, and our response to that was to call ourselves Asian Americans instead. And this logic of being other and then claiming our own otherness is actually a very common experience. It's not just for Asian Americans or Asian Canadians. It's very powerful, but it's also potentially very limiting to construct our politics around an identity. Because then what we become invested in is the identity. When what drove me to become an Asian American in the first place was not only just identity, it was principle. It was this idea that racism is wrong, dehumanization is wrong, othering people is wrong. And so what happens when we ourselves do it, whether we ourselves do it as Asians or Asian Americans, or whether we are citizens in a country that does it, we should therefore be opposed to that process of discrimination, of violence, and othering no matter where it takes place. And I have to say that it's an ongoing process for me to understand that, because the power of ideology is so strong that it prevents us from seeing our own implications very often. So in the book, A Man of Two Faces, there's a moment where I reflect upon the fact that these parents, my parents, whom I love and who I think are incredible people and who sacrificed so much and lived the American dream and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they fled as refugees in 1954 from the north to the south, in an operation that was organized by the CIA. And they, along with 800,000 other Vietnamese Catholics, were brought to the South at least partly to bolster the South Vietnamese government under the Catholic president, Ngo Dinh Diem. And the South Vietnamese government deliberately put a lot of these Vietnamese Catholics into the lands of indigenous people. And so when I think about that, I think that is actually a version of settler colonialism that my own family was involved in and that I also benefited from. And if you go talk to Vietnamese people, I mean, if you go visit Vietnam, for example, and you talk about Vietnamese history, it'll probably come up in the tour book or somehow that the Chinese colonized us for 1,000 years. Vietnamese people will never forget the Chinese colonized us for 1,000 years. But I don't think I've ever heard any Vietnamese person bring up the possibility that we've also colonized people as well. And it's that contradiction between identity and principle that expansive solidarity ruptures. And instead, our solidarity may begin in identity, but our solidarity has to end in principle.
It was, yeah, thank you. It was very inspiring to see you being active during that time. I think in these halls of academia, there was a lot of conversation, but not as much speaking out at the time. As an Asian Americanist, I'm an Asian American studies person, I guess, there was a lot of disappointment, I guess, in people that we had idolized who were like Marxists, who wrote about Cold War, genocide, massacres, who not only were like silent, but were also giving very familiar excuses for that silence. And then you had this like trickster, Viet Thanh Nguyen, like speaking out, inspiring us at a time when we really needed that. And I wonder, as somebody who has like a foot, I guess, in academia and a foot in writing, right, if that's a different thing, how do you see those two kind of forms of censorship that were happening at the time and still today? Like, how have you seen those being weighed off each other? And particularly there's long histories of this, right, with BDS and so on.
Well, I was an early, not an early, but I signed on to BDS several years ago, and that had a cost as well. I think I had one book published, The Sympathizer was translated and published in Israel, and nothing since, because I know my publisher was not happy with me signing on to BDS. And my stance has remained that BDS is nonviolent. And engage with that. If we engage with that, then maybe we wouldn't have to engage or have the violent back and forth or the violence of colonization. Anyway, I think my experience, I came into academia as an idealist, okay? I was 21 years old, and literally my application statement was, I believe that literary criticism can change the world. I was rapidly disabused of that. And one of the things that I've learned, academia has produced great ideas. There's no doubt I've learned a lot from academic theories, from Edward Said onwards and before. But the human reality of academia is that academics are human beings, which means they're petty, they're vain, and they're conformist. They have orthodoxies, no matter what their politics happen to be. And that is also true, by the way, of the literary world and Hollywood as well. So I'm a cynic. I just believe that there's a distinction between what it is that we produce as writers and as intellectuals, as artists, and the actual conduct of ourselves in our human relationships. And so I just felt that it was a test, obviously, that when I thought of myself as a writer, I didn't think of myself as, first and foremost, an American writer or an Asian American writer, although I am those kinds of writers. I thought of myself as a committed writer. That means the genealogy of writers that I looked up to and that I admired. I cited Césaire, I cited Edward Said, these kinds of writers. These are committed writers, right? They didn't see a distinction between their art and their politics. And so maybe for me in particular, there was a particular challenge that I had. This was the moment where I had to, pay the price in public for whatever it is that I believed. If you're not a committed writer, then that principle doesn't exist. But again, that is the tradition that I see myself fitting into.
Yeah, I have one more question about academia, because we are also in an academic space here. And it's a question I've actually wanted to ask you for many years. Because I came in academia, or I guess the university, with almost the opposite ideals. I really wanted to be a creative writer. I had written like 5 novels, none of which would ever see the light of day, thank God. And I was a poet, and I was just so cynical about academia. And then come one summer in 2003, I'm in Las Vegas, the air conditioning has turned off in my apartment for like 4 or 5 months. So every day I go to the university library, and I just peruse the books because it's the only place with air conditioning you can go for free besides a casino. And I happened upon an amazing book that changed my entire trajectory, which was Race and Resistance, your book from 2002. And I think I might have hinted at this to you before when we first met in 2019, just how meaningful that book was for me, how much I had always felt on the margins of Asian American identity, discourse, and it showed me that I had a voice, and also that academic writing can really speak to something inside of us very deep that I didn't believe really was possible. Fast forward 20 more years later, and almost every time I hear you bring it up, it's almost like a disappointed parent, like talking about your former self, how this book was like, a horrible experience writing it. It made you do the opposite change toward, just investing in your creative writing. Can you talk about that? Does that former self ever speak back? Does he ever get a bit cynical about you?
Sure, I'm a man of two faces, so sometimes I thought about applying scholarship and criticism to myself. But that happens in all the books. But you know what? Thank you so much for talking about race and resistance in such a way, because I truly do hate that book. But I'm glad it made an impact on you. I just remember that my high school best friend said, "Hey, I have your book, and I keep it on my bedstand so that I can fall asleep at night when I read it." That book was born out of great passion. The origins of that book are from my undergraduate thesis, actually. So it took about 10 years to realize that in the form of a book. And I stand by the ideas in the book, but the writing of it was very painful for me, because it was, again, my way of becoming an academic, my way of becoming professionalized, being inserted into an academic culture, speaking to my dissertation committee, speaking to the people who would give me tenure and all of that. And I had grander ambitions, and it was, the grander ambitions were not simply that I wanted to be a writer and write fiction, which I did. The grander ambitions was this idea that the intellectual work that we do, Chris, you and I, and many of the people in this room, these intellectual ideas actually have real power and real meaning. And there's a room for academic jargon, and there's a necessity for it in some circumstances. But I just felt that for me, I turned to academic jargon as a way of hiding from myself and what I wanted to say. And I really believed, go back to that idealistic self, I actually really do believe that criticism can change the world. We see examples. Edward Said changed the world with Orientalism and with other books, and I can point to other academics who have done the same thing. And I think he did it because he embraced his passions and he gave voice to his passions and he wrote in a language that a larger public could understand. And when I say larger public, I don't mean Oprah's book club. I mean the fact that a lot of academics cannot speak to people in the other building on the same campus. That's a problem. So I wrote another book called Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War. And I wrote that book, that was published, I think, 14 years after Race and Resistance. It took me that long because it took me 10 years to learn academic language and 10 years to unlearn academic language. But the book itself is very academic in the sense that there's a lot of theory, there's a lot of philosophy and everything like that, but it's written in a narrative fashion. And the intended audience for that book was booksellers. Because I'd gone on book tour for the Sympathizer, I met a lot of very intelligent booksellers, we had really great conversations, and I understood that they didn't want to read academic books, but they were also very, very smart. So could I write a book to speak to that audience? And to this day, I mean, I think academics do read Nothing Ever Dies, but my greatest joy comes when people who are not academics come up to me and say, this book really moved me. And that's everybody from college students to veterans returning from our wars of the United States. And so I believe, I don't know how many of you out there are academics, graduate students, professors, and so on, but I believe in academia. I believe in the scholarship that we do, and I believe it matters, and I believe more of us could reach a larger public if we tried.
Cheers to that, yeah, I agree. I do want to create a kind of arc through your work from Race and Resistance, because I think there is the seeds there of what I see in Man of Two Faces, in your novels and short stories, which is this kind of struggle between, and I tend to read things through desire and pleasure a bit more than maybe you articulate them, but this struggle between desiring belonging, or desiring empowerment, and all the kind of things that bring us to understand our own histories under particular, like state-given, institutional-given narratives. And I'm thinking of like Gia Tolentino, who was the first speaker for the series, who has been speaking a lot about, not really against identity politics, I would say, but more about unionization and different forms of like transnational solidarities. Or like Kathy Park Hong, who talks about the stay-in-your-lane politics, right, and how, do we really want to keep investing in types of identities and very state-narrated histories, even though they look great on like grant applications or maybe on academic books and blurbs and things like that. But as a site of like radical politics or of change-making, maybe has, I think I've heard you say this before, speak in these terms, that it's been too successful almost in some ways. How do you see yourself positioned among those other like thinkers on this, because you are the one with the like PhD who's read like a lot of the same works that I guess critical race studies scholars are really invested in. Do you see that conversation as like, do you agree with their takes on it, or how do you see it?
Well, I think that it's a position of, again, in this case, paradoxical thinking. I mean, I think we have to engage with identity politics. We have to engage with race and other forms of identity, because it's through these identities that capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and so on have been enacted, right? And so it makes sense that we respond via those identities. And so identity politics is actually still very meaningful. But again, I return to that earlier theme. If you end with identity politics, then you've reached a dead end. Right? The beginning with identity politics should teach you some of the things that you mentioned that Gia Tolentino and Kathy Park Hong are talking about. Beginning with identity politics, beginning with being Asian, for example, or Asian American or Asian Canadian, should lead you to a critique of capitalism and colonialism. If it doesn't, then there's a problem, I think, but this is actually the dilemma that we are facing in the United States, and I assume here in Canada, that Asian Americans and Asian North Americans have been so successful in certain respects that it is tempting to simply belong and to assimilate, to claim the citizenship, to claim the inclusion, and to accept the practices of these countries, even when they're carrying out reactionary or negative policies in terms of capitalism or immigration or war and so on. So again, it's not either or, and I think that's the danger. It's when people say, well, look, identity politics is a problem and we should really just be focusing on class conflict instead. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. I mean, exploitation through class and labor, for example, is routed through national and racial and gendered identities. These things are inseparable. So we have to have the complexity of thinking to engage on all fronts at the same time.
So we can clap at the end of every question, it's fine. As we should. There's a miniseries coming out based on your first novel on the Sympathizer. And I wanted to get your take back to, you were talking about Apocalypse Now and how that had this formative moment for you of like racial difference, understanding your own history. Apart from the people who might be sitting next to you watching that same film, how do you see the Sympathizer miniseries like affecting the audience?
Wow. I've seen the first 5 episodes in rough cut form, which means there's no, the special effects aren't finished, the sound isn't finished. So I'm viewing an incomplete product, but I think I can safely say that it's at least good. It's not a ringing endorsement, right? Because I'm totally biased. It's at least good. And they're going to release the 3rd teaser very soon, and I think it's very exciting. So I don't know. I'm not sure what impact it's going to have. I'm not sure that people are ready to watch a 7-part miniseries about the Vietnam War and its aftermath in the same way that they'd be excited about Game of Thrones, for example, or Bridgerton or something like that. Not to disparage any of those things. I'm just saying that the Vietnam War is number one, a heavy topic, but also a topic that's ancient history. And it's kind of ironic to say that in the context of Game of Thrones, which doesn't even exist in real history, but the Vietnam War is ancient history. I mean, it ended in 1975, which is, almost 50 years ago. When I was growing up in the 80s, that would be like thinking about the Depression era for me. And that was ancient history to me when I was in my teens and my 80s. So it's such ancient history that after HBO, whoever in the upper reaches saw the first few episodes, they were like, I think we need a preface. I think we need something at the beginning to tell people what this history is about. And so it fell on me as the writer to write that. And I was like, oh my God, are you serious? I have to write a prologue to the TV series? I mean, do you need a prologue to Game of Thrones to set you up, And why? So if you can watch Game of Thrones, and accept everything that happens in there, and you don't need any explanation, somehow you need it for a real history. But anyway, I wrote it. So I think that it's inevitably going to serve a pedagogical purpose because some of the people in this room are old enough, to have lived through the era of the Vietnam War, but a lot of you were born after the war was finished. It literally is history. So there will be a pedagogical purpose to it, and it's terrible to turn to an HBO TV series for your education, okay? I think you should watch it, but it's a bad idea to use it for education. But nevertheless, that's what will happen because, again, that unofficial ministry of propaganda, this is how a lot of people learn about their history is through Hollywood or the equivalent. So I hope it's also a spectacle, and I think it is from what I've seen of it. And this is why it was so important to have Park Chan-wook be the director of this or the co-showrunner and the director of many of the episodes, and I think probably the primary creative genius that's pushing this along. And this is because when I wrote The Sympathizer, Park Chan-wook's Old Boy was a major influence on The Sympathizer, stylistically and politically and excessively. So if you know Park Chan-wook's work as an auteur, he's excessive in every way, and that's a good thing because his work is very entertaining to watch, it's very provocative, it's very spectacular, and it's also deeply political and deeply historical all at the same time. So I felt that he had the sensitivity and the knowledge, but also the aesthetic capacity to do a very difficult thing, which is to take a novel that's entirely an interior monologue and try to translate that voice into a visual palette, and I think that he has succeeded in doing that. And he earned my trust because, when he came to my house, and it was very clear during that conversation that he had actually read the novel. This was not true for most of the Hollywood people that I met. He had read the novel. And he had all these comments, and he had all these suggestions, and he had all these questions. I was like, why weren't you there when I was actually writing the novel? It might have been a better novel as a result. So he has a real storytelling impulse that he brings to the series. So in conclusion, what I will say is, what you're going to get with whether the series is good or great, what you're going to get is 7 hours of TV. And yes, Robert Downey Jr. plays all the white guys in the TV series, almost all of them. There's a surprise in there for you that I won't talk to you about. But he plays most of the white guys in the TV series. And it's interesting because one of my critiques of Apocalypse Now and all the movies like it is that these movies depict Americans badly, doing bad things. But they put those Americans at center stage. So even though we know they're committing atrocities, they're still the movie stars. That's kind of like Robert Downey Jr.'s role in this TV series, and he's probably going to get some awards for it, and he should. He's great. However, outside of Robert Downey Jr., outside of Sandra Oh, you're going to get 7 hours of Hua Suan Day in almost every single shot, playing the captain, as he's called in this TV series. You're going to get 7 hours of a mostly Vietnamese cast. You're going to get 7 hours of Vietnamese people speaking. A lot of it's in English, but a lot of it is in Vietnamese as well. This was very important for me. I couldn't watch Chernobyl, for example, because Chernobyl is set in the Soviet Union and everybody's speaking English. I'm like, what is going on? This makes no sense. And so it was very important that we have a lot of this actually done in the Vietnamese language. And so that, I think, just that sheer presence of 7 hours of Vietnamese faces, Vietnamese voices, Vietnamese stories, even if you disagree with the stories that are being presented, that's going to have an emotional, material impact in a world in which everybody is so used to seeing white Americans telling us about the Vietnam War.
What about, I want to shift a bit to new media, because in Nothing Ever Dies, as in a lot of your newer work, you seem to center a lot on film and television with this miniseries. I'm not really a film and television person. I just can't really watch any of it for some reason. But I'm a video game person. I'm a scholar of video games as well. And you mentioned in Nothing Ever Dies, I think, video games, like once very briefly, which is basically just to say how horrible they are. And I was like, Viet, why? But I also get it. Like, it's fair. Like, in terms of like racism and war on terror, yes, absolutely. But I'm also wondering about your take on, when you were young watching Apocalypse Now, what is it like now for younger people, your son, my son, perhaps, growing up with like Roblox, with TikTok, with social media, and is their moment even going to come from film, or is it going to come from something else? And what is that going to be like?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me say that my own son, he's 10 years old, who I named after a novelist, Ralph Ellison. My son's name is Ellison. Yeah, he wants to be a video game designer. That's what he wants to do, and I'm sort of okay with it, I guess. In fact, I do the Asian parent thing. I'm like, oh, he wants to go to USC, my university, to go to the video game design program there. It's like the #1 program in the country. I'm like, okay, you can go to the #1 video game design program in the country. You just got to work your butt off to do it. And so that's how I've resolved the problem. But I think you're right. I mean, the video game industry is bigger than Hollywood, obviously. And video games are also an art. I don't dispute any of that. I think in Nothing Ever Dies, I was only critical of the role that video games have played in terms of fantasizing about war. And that is literally true. I mean, Call of Duty, for example, not only does that in general, but the Call of Duty has a whole episode that's inspired by the Vietnam War, and I show that to my class. And so, yes, I think that this. Not even my son's generation or your son's generation, but my generation, I grew up playing video games too. And look at me now, so I'm not opposed to the idea of video games in general. What's interesting for me is that video games are not exempt from any of the issues that I've been talking about. So when we talk about unofficial ministries of propaganda and industries of memory and industries of art, the video game industry is right at the heart of that. So if video games offer an opportunity to resist, does that happen at the level of billion-dollar video games? I don't know, because I don't play them. You obviously know better than I do, but I hope there is that space for video games to do something else besides replicate mass ideology.
Yes, there is. I don't want to take any stage presence, but yeah, I have a book called Open World Empire that's about that, but I'm not going to get too into that. But it is, I guess, all things are possible in our media landscape. But yeah, I think it is. In our seminar, for example, the last 2 weeks we've been playing video games. There's this game called This War of Mine, where you're playing survivors of war, and you're basically just trying to survive, but it gets you to think very ethically about the moral dimensions of survival. What does that mean in who you have to leave behind and things like that. And then the DLC, the downloadable content, is about kids. So I'm unable to play that part because that's a bit too much for me. But yeah, it's out there. On that note, let me move to a bit of a different subject, which is my late wife, Yidang Trung, who was a faculty member here in the English department and passed away in 2022 from pancreatic cancer. She had a posthumously published book, Land Bridge, where she talks very briefly about you in a silly way, as we tend to do. But a lot of that book is also, to ask a question that I know she would want to know. A lot of that book is about the burdens of writing that refugee story, having to speak to so many different audiences, being accountable to so many different audiences, and it is a posthumously published book, right? And so I think, having been there while she was writing it, knowing that she wasn't going to live to see it being published, I think also released her from that burden quite a bit. At the same time, you have been doing this for a long time, and you make it look so easy. Being able to speak to so many of these audiences, to the home country audience in a way, the host country audience, communities, the middlebrow literary audience who is usually mostly white. How do you navigate these things? Do you even are you able to just kind of not care about them, or how do you manage the ways that other authors have kind of gone mad in some senses due to that?
I mean, first of all, let me just say I'm deeply moved by Yidang's story. I knew her when she was a grad student, and we tried to recruit her to come to USC, my university, as a postdoc, but then she got a better offer because she was brilliant. That's basically what happened. She had more offers than she could handle. And I've taught her first book, Refugee Life Worlds, in my graduate seminar. And so it's a tragedy that she wasn't able to continue on the trajectory that was clearly a trajectory into greatness, as someone who started off as an academic, who's probably going to continue as an academic, but who's someone who did exactly what I said that we should do, which is to use academic knowledge combined with the ferocity of writing to express both our ideas and our emotions, and also to reach a larger audience outside of academia. With Landbridge, we shared similar approaches. It's a fragmentary book that she was writing. And if you look at A Man of Two Faces, it's also a fragmentary book as well. And I think we were responding formally to a shared history. My way of articulating that was that history had blown up Vietnam and had scattered the Vietnamese, 4 million Vietnamese people all over the world into the diaspora, shattered the country itself, and would take so long for the country to reconstruct itself, and arguably Vietnam is still reconstructing itself. And so nation states construct narratives of wholeness, which are fictions. I think the idea of Vietnam as a unified country is a fictive narration because it papers over so many fractures and divisions. But in the diaspora, it's clear we're fragmented. And so the form of A Man of Two Faces expresses that, not just reflects that. And I think there's some of that in Landbridge as well. So the audience is fragmented too. It's one thing when I speak to your graduate seminars, another thing when I speak to Asian Americans, it's another thing when I speak to audiences, all over the United States. I mean, typically I'm called on to go to speak to audiences that are primarily white. And if I thought about it too much, I would freak out, I would, I mean, I've been in those situations like, oh my God, what are they gonna think when I say America is built on genocide? And then I just have to go with it, right? Let's be clear here. Even when I get invited to red states like Idaho, I get invited to the blue parts of red states. I don't think I've been to the red parts of red states yet. So maybe the reaction would be different in those kinds of contexts. But the issue is that people in the red parts of red states don't apparently read books. So I'm not likely to be invited to those parts of the country. I am not kidding, okay? I'm not kidding. Amazon.com has a function, I haven't looked at it in a long time, but it has a function that shows you where your books are selling. And my books are selling in the blue states and the blue parts of red states, but there are like literally vast swaths of the map where it's not selling a single copy, okay? Okay, so maybe they're just not reading my books. They might be reading other books, okay? But I think that there has to be a consistency of message. For me, if I was to go into different audiences and I would have to, if I just recalibrated myself for every audience and I said, well, with Asian Americans I can say this, and with white people I can say that, then I probably would go crazy. I don't even want to use that metaphor. Then I would probably be deeply frustrated and angry. But I don't. I say the same things. I say the same things. And I think that's important. That goes back to the question of a principle. If a principle doesn't cost you anything, it's not a principle. Okay? If you adjust yourself to different situations based on the context, that's not a principled stance. So I have to say the same things to different audiences and hope that they understand what I'm saying. You didn't have to clap for that one.
Thank you. One of the most joyful moments that I remember from that last year after she was diagnosed was actually when we received the blurbs for Refugee Life Worlds, her first academic book, and you were one of the blurbers, and you had blurbers? I don't know if that's... but you just had your writing in that moment, and the others, Jasbir Pawar was another, for example. So thank you for that. That really meant a lot to her. I do want to end with a question before we get to the Slido audience questions, which I think is a simple one maybe, but it's, I see your work as it did for me, and as it still has done for me, not just from your first book, but seeing you and being able to go through all these genres has really been influential to a lot of people. And I see you opening up a lot of space. How do you envision the next generation who comes after you? Like, what comes after someone like you who's opened up so much space to talk about these issues? I have spent a lot of time thinking about the war in Vietnam and its consequences for myself, my family, for the Vietnamese refugee community, for Vietnam. And I do that because I'm obsessed. That's the history that shaped me and produced me, gave me the motivations and the passions to become a writer. But I'm sick and tired of it, honestly. And so I want to write one more book, the third and final novel of the Sympathizer trilogy, that will still have the shadow of the war in Vietnam falling upon our narrator. And then I would like to write about something else, honestly, for a while. Not to leave it behind. I don't think it can ever be left behind, but I would like to focus on something else. But I look at a newer generation, and it's tempting to say, to look at a newer generation born after 9/11, for example, and to say, wow, these young people, what do they know? What do they know about history? And I try not to say that, because that's exactly what 80-year-old Vietnamese people say to me. Like, who are you to talk about Vietnamese history? You don't know anything. And they're right, I don't know anything, but I know what I know. And likewise, a younger generation knows what it knows as well. And recently I went to speak to the Vietnamese Student Association at USC. And I've known the Vietnamese Student Associations over time. 15 or 20 years ago, there was a huge conflict at my university over what flag the campus should fly in the International Hall to represent Vietnam.
Should it be the red flag with the yellow star, which was what was actually hanging there, the flag of the current government, or should it be the yellow flag with the 3 red stripes, which is actually officially commemorated as the Vietnam heritage flag by the state of California? Okay, so it's really an official thing. And so there was a meeting of the Vietnamese American students and the Vietnamese international students. And the Vietnamese international students said, you know, the war's over, it's a matter of the past, we should move on and reconcile. And the Vietnamese American students said, no, we cannot. The war has damaged our parents, and they have passed that legacy on to us, and we must respect their resentment. Fast forward 15 or 20 years, I go to this VSA meeting. They invite me specifically to talk about April 30th, the anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam. There are about 30 or 40 students. About a quarter of them are actually Vietnamese international students. And no one cared about the politics. To them, it was ancient history. They literally wanted a history lesson about the significance of April 30th and the war. But outside of that, it was boba time. I mean, literally, they had boxes of boba tea there. And after the serious historical discussion and discussion of identity and all that stuff, we all had boba together. Boba politics, you know, boba reconciliation. And so I don't know what comes next. It's those students, this generation, that's going to determine their own fate and consign me and my books to the dustbin of history, as it should be.
So please remember you can submit your questions on Slido, and you can also vote for other people's questions, and that's always a fun thing to do. I'm going to tether 2 of these questions together because they're kind of on the same topic. But the first is, during the ongoing genocide being committed against Palestinians, what is the responsibility of those in academic institutions to speak up about the violence? And the other is, learning from the Vietnam War, how do you think we, as allies in solidarity, can support Palestinians in reclamation of their voice or narrative in media?
Sometimes I wish I was the kind of author who just got literary questions from the audience. I mean, the first question about academics, you know, I mean, first of all, again, I'm disillusioned about academia. Did we ever stand up for stuff? I don't know. I mean, I'm a little skeptical about these kinds of demands placed upon academics and scholars. Not that I think they shouldn't be. It just, I think it elevates what academics have generally done. But for those of us whose work has intersected with questions of power, racism, imperialism, colonization, inequities of various kinds, yes, I think there is an obligation to consider how these things play out in the historical relationship of the United States to Israel, of Israel's occupation, of Israel's war, our support of it, but then also that longer history of colonization that I just discussed. So for me, you know, what's happened since October 7th has been enormously stressful, but I've been grateful for it because it's allowed me to sharpen political, ethical, intellectual edges that I've had. And I think that is the opportunity that's offered to all of us whose work has intersected with any of the kinds of issues that have been brought up, not just with October 7th, but everything that has preceded it in Israel and Palestine. The second question was about the amplification of Palestinian stories and Palestinian voices. Well, I mean, part of the problem is that obviously a lot of what's happening right now is already being told. It's not a problem, but a lot of what's happening right now is already being told by Palestinians through social media, and this goes back to the video game angle as well. I mean, literature is almost inherently a time-delayed art form. It takes a while, number one, to write something and to publish it and all that, but it also takes time to process. You know, I think it's very telling that it usually takes, you know, if we look at Asian American literature, for example, the lag time is usually 3 or 4 decades between something that happens and the story being told, because it's taken that long for people to process the emotions and the trauma and to develop the literary skills in order to tell that kind of a story. And when it doesn't take that lag time, oftentimes the stories arrive too early. I think of John Okada's novel No Boy, published in, I think, 1956 or 1957, about the Japanese American internment in incarceration. That was only 10 or 12 years after the end of World War II, and no one wanted to read the book. So he actually wrote that book really quickly, and then nobody wanted to read it. And so in my case, it did take 30 or 40 years to process the history of the war in Vietnam and write the book, but by then I had an audience for it. So I had a huge advantage over John Okada. So in the case of Palestinians, I don't know how long, I mean, there already are Palestinian writers writing about this, but in terms of Palestinians who are living through what is taking place, it's going to take time to produce something like literature. But in the meantime, there is social media. It's raw, it's unfiltered, these are voices, right? And honestly, I mean, the most difficult thing about watching videos for me that come out of what's happening in Gaza is not the video, it's the audio. I have to turn off the audio, you know. And so when we talk about hearing voices and you know, you hear some of what's being said, and that just you don't have to understand it. You know, just the timbre of the voices, the emotions, and all that kind of stuff. Just turn that on, and you'll get a sense of the power of what's taking place. And then for those of us who have the capacity to do things like, you know, publishing people, opening doors, opening gates, these kinds of things, we should take on those opportunities. You know, we should be, those of us who are literary people, academic people, we have the capacity to organize events, fundraisers, literary events, poetry readings, all that kind of stuff I've been involved with as well. And this may, and honestly, obviously it all feels very inadequate in the face of what's going on. But it is something that we, in our capacity, can do, and we should be doing those kinds of things.
The next two questions, well, one of them just went down, but one of them shot up as soon as I declared that you could vote on this.
You have to have a cell phone desk. I don't own one.
Oh, I think you do. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I loved your film section of that, the filming in the Philippines in your book. And then you were as pithy about the Vietnamese as the Americans, as the French. Nobody comes off well. But I'd stand here, I'm sorry, young man, but I'm sorry about your wife because I've read it. No. I, as a Canadian, am embarrassed when we clap when you're negative about Americans because my son, my grandson, my deceased husband, Americans, Choctaw Native, and first of all, you know, home in Texas, and I'm sorry.
I will try to amplify the comments after you were done. No.
Okay, I just wanted to say though, I don't know what Americans you're talking about when they believe the Vietnam War, and you know that it was wonderful. I never know what Americans you're talking about because certainly not my family believe these things that you say.
First of all, the compliment was that the Sympathizer was really, really fun around the filmmaking segment, and that's true. And you know, just a little tidbit. It was that scene that was set in the Philippines. I really wanted to have that be shot in the Philippines, but Park Chan-wook in his genius said, no, we're going to do it in the California mountains. I said, okay, you're Park Chan-wook. So it's all been transplanted to the California mountains, much less spectacular. But it works, and it's episode number 4, and it's hilarious. Your comment, however, was about your experience as an American and with American.
Canadian, sorry.
I'm sorry, with American relatives, born Canadian with American relatives, and that the Americans that you have known have not endorsed the narrative that I just described, which is about the celebration of genocide, et cetera, et cetera. Oh yeah, I mean, I think we're a divided country, of course. I mean, of course there are Americans who are cognizant of the history of the country and who are opposed to the wars, some of the wars that we've carried out, and who are aware of things like genocide and colonialism and things like that. But honestly, I do think there are quite a number of Americans who totally, you know, number one, would never accept the definition of genocide as being a part of American history, would excuse the processes of colonization. They might say that, yes, we had colonialism, but it was a good thing. You know, I think that's actually very common. And would be pro-war in a lot of ways. I mean, I still get, I Okay, I'll admit to this. You already know this if you've read A Man of Two Faces. In A Man of Two Faces, there's a whole page devoted to the one-star reviews of the Sympathizer, okay? So I do, in fact, read my Amazon.com reviews. If you want to hurt my feelings, go ahead, go. Although honestly, I'll tell you, if you want to hurt my feelings, write a 3-star review. 3-star reviews kind of suck. 1-star reviews, I enjoy. Because I'm happy that I pissed you off so much, you had to write a 1-star review. But anyway, in some of the reviews of The Sympathizer, but also A Man of Two Faces, I mean, there are people who will say, this is an anti-American book. And so clearly I'm provoking somebody out there, that segment of the population, American population, that does in fact read my books and disagrees with them, will in fact argue that maybe these facts happened in American history, but my interpretation is wrong. You know, and to go back to the history of the Vietnam War, I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to quote Jimmy Carter is that Jimmy Carter's a good liberal, okay? But yet even Jimmy Carter would say it was a war of mutual destruction. And so that reinterpretation, that containment of the meaning of the war in Vietnam is a bipartisan endeavor. It's not just Republicans or conservatives who are trying to put a good spin on the war in Vietnam, but it's also Democrats participate just as much from Barack Obama back to Jimmy Carter. And so, you know, I think that we are living in a time in which, yes, there is more sophistication on the part of some Americans about the complexities and contradictions of our bloody history, and that there's also obviously a great resistance to that interpretation as well. If there wasn't, we wouldn't have a divided country as we do now.
Ooh, okay. Thank you for that. I guess I want to just extend that a little bit before where you were going, that kind of fragmentation, because like in trying to figure out the questions for this talk, for example, I had so many different like fragmented audiences wanting me to ask you certain questions about all of the things that are happening in the US right now. And one thing that kept coming up, and I wasn't sure how to approach it, was about how so-called undocumented migrants, or the issue of migrancy coming from the South, and how this always seems to come up during an election season, and suddenly, you know, the xenophobia and vitriol just, you know, intensify to this, like I can't even go to the US right now without just feeling nauseous all the time. And I'm from the US, and so I have an interesting relationship to the homeland in that sense. But I think that, and there's also like 110 million people displaced in the world right now. And that fragmentariness of the US, I'm always conflicted about it, because on one hand, there's people like you, there's all these amazing traditions of radicalism and of critique, but then you're just kind of inundated in this, you know, wherever you turn, even though I don't even watch TV, and it's just everywhere. How do you, I feel like when you're speaking to that audience, you're also, you know, trying to get under their skin in a way. But how do you deal with that, like all those issues kind of coming to the fore, and again, you being the kind of writer that people want to ask you about all of them?
Well, I mean, I think that was one reason why, you know, I wanted to you know, make sure in the talk that make clear that I'm criticizing liberals as much as I'm criticizing conservatives. I mean, it's easy, you know, in the United States to draw these divisions and these battle lines, and if you're on the liberal side of the division, to say, oh, it's the red states or the Trump supporters or MAGA that has all these terrible notions about our country and do things like demonize migrants and so on. But in all honesty, I think that liberals in the United States also have a dominant version of American ideology that's very hard for them to see past. And that's the ideology of American exceptionalism still. It's the idea that we're the greatest country on earth. You cannot convince most Americans that they don't have the greatest country on earth. You can give them all kinds of statistics. You cannot convince them. You can say, look at Canada. No, we're not going to look at Canada. They're just a province of the United States, you know. And so that's the American attitude. And it is actually, you know, I mean, it's enormously frustrating for me to be an American and to be an American citizen and to live in the United States as well. And sometimes I fantasize about that what happened, you know, a few years ago when, I don't remember if it was UBC or another Canadian university extended an invitation to me to apply for a job. And I was like, oh, I should do it, shouldn't I? And I just couldn't make myself in the end. Because I think I'm still attached to the country. I'm still an American. I still feel like there are battles to be fought. And even though I might want to leave the country, what happens to everybody else who has no choice but to stick behind and to carry out these kinds of battles? But again, the issue is that so much of the divisions within the United States are domestic. They're domestic around partisan issues, like how do you stand on migration, how do you stand on taxes, and so on. But there's a unity around foreign policy, which is, the United States has a right to fire drone missiles into any country it wants at any time that it wants. Democrats are just as good as Republicans at doing that. And I'll never forget when The Committed came out, one of the first interviews was conducted by a Guardian journalist, and he said, and Joe Biden had just been elected, and he said, yeah, so Joe Biden got elected, great, he's another imperialist. So from outside the United States, from within the United States, we make a huge issue over the differences between the parties and the presidents and so on. From outside the United States, if you're being bombed, it may not make much of a difference. And I think Americans have a hard time perceiving that. And so, much of my thinking as a writer and a scholar and so on is predicated upon not treating the domestic issues of the United States in isolation from its foreign policy, because the foreign policy was at one point in the past the domestic issue. Settler colonialism is foreign policy turned into the domestic affairs of the country. And so that is the history in which I see myself as a writer trying to make an intervention, not just telling a story about Asian Americans, as important as that story is, but to tell a story about the United States as a whole and these contradictions on which we were founded and these contradictions which still drive our foreign policy and which makes us do things like pay for the weapons that are being used to kill Gazans and Palestinians and civilians by the billions of dollars, and then we sprinkle some millions of dollars of aid via parachute on them. That is a catch-22 level of absurdity that is our reality as Americans.
And I can hear my Canadian colleagues in the room also saying, like, don't let Canada get off so light. Yeah, Canada's kind of the good cop to America's bad cop in a lot of ways. Just to throw that out there. So I'm not ignoring them. On that note, actually, the top question that keeps coming up is about Oppenheimer and what that might say about American memory. I assume the movie Oppenheimer, which again, I don't watch, but I have heard you briefly mention Oppenheimer in social media posts and things, and I'm also curious about your take on this, the mainstream effect of this film.
What can I say? Robert Downey Jr. won an Oscar for it, so if I criticize it, I have to go to, I'm going to see him in a few weeks. I haven't seen the movie actually, I think it was in resistance to this idea that we're going to have this spectacle foisted on us as well. And I'm kind of disabused of Christopher Nolan's genius. In the last few movies I've seen of his have been sort of these empty spectacles. I mean, they've been marvelous works of technical artistry and just like soulless in the interior. So I don't know what Oppenheimer is going to be. I mean, I'm sure Robert Downey Jr.'s performance is great. I'm just saying the movie itself, I don't know. And so I just couldn't bring myself to watch it. On the other hand, my kids love Barbie. So they're 10 and they're 4. They sing and they dance to the movie. And on the one hand, my 4-year-old is watching Barbie. She's a girl. On the other hand, my 10-year-old is being exposed, who's a boy, is being exposed to a version of feminism, I guess, and knows how to say patriarchy. So that's good. So that's the function that these spectacles serve. Every time I'm tempted to go see a spectacle in the movie theaters, I walk away thinking, why did I just do that when I already knew what the effect was going to be in the first place? So it's, what I said about Oppenheimer, I think, on social media was a quotation, I like quoting myself, a quotation from the Sympathizer, which is about the American movie industry, that it was an industry in which America would drop blockbusters all over the world in the form of movies, softening up the entire world up until the moment that we decided to bomb them for real. And Oppenheimer feels conceptually that way, that, yes, we dropped the bomb, multiple bombs, on Japan, and what we're going to do is make a blockbuster out of it from the American point of view, which is exactly what happened in the Vietnam War movies made from the United States as well. We're just going to kill 3 million people, but we're going to turn it into a drama for Americans, and as I've said, about America's version of the war in Vietnam. From the American perspective, it was a civil war in the American soul, for which the Vietnamese were just the backdrop, and that literally seems to be what is happening with Oppenheimer as well.
To stay on the topic of film, the next top question, are you seeing any parallels with the filming of your novel and the filming of the movie within the Sympathizer, which is Apocalypse Now, kind of?
Well, let me just say that yes, I was inspired by Apocalypse Now and by the legend of the making of the movie and of Francis Ford Coppola. I read everything that was written about Coppola and about the making of the movie. It's all very juicy stuff, and a lot of it makes it into the satire in the novel. But really, the movie that's being satirized is not actually Apocalypse Now. It's actually much more the worst version of American cinema about the Vietnam War, which was John Wayne's The Green Berets. What can I say? If you've ever watched The Green Berets, it is literally an act of American propaganda. It is so bad. And, you know, the original version of Apocalypse Now, the script was actually written by John Milius, who wrote it much more as a World War II type of story, and then, you know, Francis Ford Coppola decided to do it as Heart of Darkness instead. And so when they were making this into the TV series, this novel, and, you know, and we knew there was going to be a whole episode devoted to the making of the movie, I said I would love to be cast as an extra who gets blown up, because I feel that's the perfect fate for an author in the adaptation of his own TV series, is to be murdered. You know, that's what I deserve. Park Chan-wook did not agree, and I do have a cameo, much less spectacular, and I do get a few words, and that was not scripted. And it takes place in a Chinese restaurant, of all things, where I'm the photographer. And I get to say, "Can we turn on the mirror ball, please?" And that wasn't in the script. And immediately after the shooting of that scene, one of the production assistants ran up to me and said, "We have to have you sign a contract because you said something, and now you have to have a SAG contract." And then Park Chan-wook gave me a great compliment, I think. He said, "Yeah, I directed John le Carré in his cameo as well. And he took forever. You only took 3 takes." So that was my experience. And then I was in the mountains above Los Angeles when they were shooting the making of the movie, and it was really disconcerting because here we are on a TV set with Park Chan-wook and all the actors and the crew, literally dozens and dozens of people, all gathered around another set with a bunch of actors playing movie makers in that. And even the cast and crew of the Sympathizer TV series were getting confused as to who was who in this whole moment. So it felt like it was the perfect moment for me. And I was actually present during the moment, if you've read the novel, during the moment when the captain gets blown up. The big climax of that whole scene is when the auteur gets to realize his ambition and just blow up the entire set with bombs and explosives. And that's actually recreated. And so here is the movie-making magic, you know, when you see it, I think when you see it, I'm not sure, but because the special effects haven't been put in, you'll probably see a huge number of explosions that take place, but in actuality, they only set off one explosion. The rest of it is digital. But it was such a big deal. Literally the entire crew, dozens of people gathered on the hillside overlooking the moment when the special effects crews set off that one tiny bomb. It was such a big deal. And it was sort of deflating to see, wow, that was just one little bomb. I wanted them to destroy the whole landscape. But no, it's all going to be digital special effects. So that'll just ruin some of the movie magic for you, movie-making magic for you when you see it. But what can I say? It's a hall of mirrors. It's a hall of mirrors, which is why, in the end, I agreed to having the novel converted into a TV series because that would just simply complete the illusion that led to the writing of the novel in the first place. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to
University of
end
British
now.
Columbia.
And I really want to thank you, Viet, for coming and for your courage, your creativity, your inspiration. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, thank you. I see you.